In the time before time was measured by stone monuments or written words, when the world was younger and the veil between realms grew thin with each setting sun, there existed sacred groves that held secrets older than memory itself. These were not ordinary woodlands, but sanctuaries where ancient oaks stretched their gnarled branches toward starlit skies, their roots drinking deeply from springs that bubbled with the earth's own dreams. Picture, if you will, a twilight forest somewhere in the heart of what would one day be called Britain, or perhaps Gaul, or the Emerald Hills of Ireland. The exact location matters less than the feeling, that sense of stepping into a place where ordinary rules bend like willow branches in an evening breeze. Here, in these hallowed groves, mist gathered not merely from the cooling air, but from the breath of spirits who had watched over these lands since the first acorn sprouted into the first sacred oak. The trees themselves seemed to whisper as you approached, their leaves rustling with voices speaking languages that predated human speech. Each oak was a cathedral, its trunk so massive that it would take a dozen people holding hands to encircle it, its bark scarred and weathered by centuries of seasons, bearing the marks of lightning strikes that the ancients believed were messages from the gods above. These trees had witnessed the passage of countless generations, had sheltered both kings and beggars beneath their sprawling canopy, had stood as silent sentinels while empires rose and fell like waves upon distant shores. Between these mighty oaks, clearings opened like natural amphitheatres, carpeted with moss that glowed silver-green in the moonlight. Here, stone circles had been raised by hands, long since returned to dust, each megalith positioned with mathematical precision that spoke of knowledge beyond what later civilizations would credit to these ancient peoples. The stones hummed with an energy that modern minds struggle to comprehend, their surfaces carved with spiral symbols that seemed to writhe and dance when glimpsed from the corner of one's eye. It was in these sacred spaces that the Druids made their home, not in grand temples of marble and gold, but in living cathedrals of oak and ash, where the roof was the sky itself, and the walls were formed by trees older than any human construction. They understood something that would be forgotten in the rush toward cities and civilization, that the deepest truths could only be whispered by wind through leaves, that the most profound wisdom grew from soil enriched by countless autumns of fallen foliage. The very word Druid carries within it the essence of these sacred groves, deriving from ancient Celtic roots that speak of oak knowledge, tree wisdom, the deep understanding that comes from communion with the forest itself. They were the Druides, the ones who knew the oak, who could read the future in the flight of birds through branches, who understood that each tree was both individual and part of a greater network of root and fungus and shared consciousness that connected forest to forest across the entire Celtic world. To encounter a Druid in their natural element was to witness something that belonged more to dream than to waking life. They moved through their groves like shadows given form, their white robes seeming to glow with captured moonlight, their bare feet making no sound on the forest floor. Some said they could become one with the trees themselves, disappearing into oak bark, only to emerge from an ash grove miles away. Others whispered that they spoke the old language of the trees, and that the oaks would bend their branches to shelter these wise ones from rain or snow. Their faces bore the marks of deep contemplation, eyes that held the depth of forest pools, lined with years of studying star patterns and the subtle movements of earth and sky. They wore their hair long and unbound, often adorned with sprigs of mistletoe or leaves that seemed to never wither, no matter how many seasons passed. Around their necks hung torques of gold and silver, twisted metal that caught the light of sacred fires, and threw back reflections that seemed to hold visions of other times, other worlds. But perhaps most remarkable was the silence that surrounded them. Not the absence of sound, but a quality of quiet that seemed to make every whisper more significant, every breath more sacred. In their presence, the ordinary chatter of daily life fell away, replaced by an awareness of deeper rhythms, the slow pulse of sap rising in trees, the ancient heartbeat of the earth itself, the distant music of spheres wheeling in their eternal dance overhead. These groves were scattered across the Celtic lands, like stars across the night sky, each one a point of light in a vast network of sacred knowledge. From the misty hills of Scotland to the sun-drenched forests of southern Gaul, from the ancient groves of Ireland to the mysterious islands off the coast of Britain, the Druids maintained their silent vigil, their wisdom passing from master to student through spoken word and lived experience, never committed to writing, but held instead in the living memory of those who had been chosen to carry the tradition forward. The trees themselves were the libraries of the Druids, each ring of growth holding memories of years past, each branch a pathway to understanding that stretched both backward into ancestral wisdom and forward into prophecy. They believed that the oaks remembered everything, every ceremony conducted beneath their boughs, every secret whispered to their bark, every life that had begun and ended in their shade. To commune with these ancient trees was to touch the very source of Celtic wisdom, to drink from springs that had never run dry since the world was young. In the gathering dusk, when shadows grew long and the boundary between day and night became a threshold that sensitive souls could sense, the groves would fill with presences that daylight could not reveal. Spirits of ancestors would emerge from hollow trunks, their forms shimmering like heat haze, their voices joining the whisper of wind through leaves. The gods themselves were said to walk these paths when the moon was dark, their footsteps leaving no trace, but somehow changing the very essence of places where they had passed. And through it all, the Druids served as guardians and interpreters, men and women who had spent decades learning to read the subtle signs that most mortals could never perceive. They understood that the forest was alive in ways that went beyond the obvious breathing of trees and scurrying of woodland creatures. Every stone had its spirit, every spring its guardian, every clearing its particular quality of sacred energy that could be channeled and directed by those with the knowledge and dedication to do so safely. The groves were not merely places of worship, but centers of learning where young initiates would spend 20 years or more mastering the vast oral tradition that encompassed law and medicine, history and astronomy, poetry and prophecy. Here, beneath the eternal gaze of the oaks, knowledge was passed down through generations in the form of carefully memorized verses, each one a key that could unlock deeper understanding for those who proved worthy of such trust. As night settled over the forest, like a soft blanket woven from starlight and shadow, the sacred fires would be kindled in clearings scattered throughout the grove, their flames reflecting off the silver bark of birch trees and casting dancing shadows that seemed to tell stories of their own. The Druids would gather in their white robes, their voices joining in chants so old that the very words seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of creation itself, each syllable chosen not merely for meaning, but for the way it would vibrate through tree trunk and stone, calling forth responses from the hidden realms that bordered our own. As dawn painted the eastern sky with shades of rose and gold, filtering through the canopy of the sacred grove in beams that seemed to carry whispers of ancient knowledge, the true nature of the Druids began to reveal itself. They were not merely priests or mystics, though they were certainly both. They were the living libraries of their people, the keepers of wisdom that stretched back to the very roots of Celtic civilization, holders of knowledge so vast and complex that it required decades of study to master even a portion of their understanding. Picture a young person, perhaps 16 summers old, being led through morning mist to a grove where towering oaks cast shadows that had not shifted in 1,000 years. This was the beginning of a journey that would consume the next 20 years of their life, a commitment that few in any age would have the dedication to complete. The path of the Druid was not chosen lightly, for it demanded the surrender of ordinary human concerns in favor of a life dedicated to the preservation and transmission of wisdom that the Celtic peoples considered more precious than gold or silver. The education of a Druid began with silence, not the absence of learning, but the profound quiet that allows true listening. For months, initiates would do nothing but observe, their eyes learning to see the subtle signs that most people missed, the way shadows fell differently in sacred spaces, how certain trees leaned toward one another as if sharing eternal conversations, the patterns that repeated themselves in everything from the spiral of a snail shell to the great wheeling of stars overhead. Memory was the foundation upon which all Druidic knowledge rested. In a world without written books, the human mind became the sacred text, trained to hold vast stores of information with perfect accuracy. They learned to structure their thoughts like the branches of their beloved oaks, with main themes forming the trunk, while smaller details spread outward like twigs and leaves, each part supporting and giving meaning to the whole. A fully trained Druid could recite genealogies stretching back 20 generations, recount the movements of celestial bodies across centuries, and speak the exact words of laws that governed everything from property disputes to the most sacred rituals. But this was not mere memorization in the way we might understand it today. The Druids taught that knowledge must be living, breathing, growing like the trees themselves. Each story they learned was not simply a collection of facts, but a seed that could sprout new understanding depending on the soil of circumstance in which it was planted. A single tale might serve as entertainment for children, a guide for practical decision-making, a source of inspiration for warriors, and a key to spiritual mysteries, all depending on how it was told and to whom. The role of judge was perhaps the most visible of the Druids' functions in Celtic society. When disputes arose that could not be settled by local authorities, when questions of law required interpretation that touched on the deepest traditions of the people, when crimes had been committed that demanded not merely punishment, but restoration of harmony to the community, it was to the Druids that people turned for resolution. Their courts were held in the open air, beneath the spreading branches of sacred trees, with the disputants standing on earth that had witnessed countless such proceedings over the generations. The Druid judge would listen to each side with the patience of mountains, their trained memory sorting through thousands of precedents and principles that had been passed down through the oral tradition. But their judgments went beyond mere application of law. They sought to restore balance, to heal wounds that went deeper than the immediate conflict, to address not just what had happened, but why it had happened, and how such discord could be prevented in the future. The wisdom of the Druids extended far beyond human law into the natural world itself. They were students of the sky, able to predict the movements of moon and planets with accuracy that would impress even modern astronomers. They understood that the cycles above mirrored the cycles below, that the same forces that governed the blooming of flowers and the migration of birds also influenced human affairs in ways both subtle and profound. Their knowledge of medicine was legendary throughout the Celtic lands. They could read the language of plants, understanding which herbs would heal and which would harm, how to combine different elements to create remedies that treated not just symptoms, but underlying causes. They knew that true healing involved not just the body, but the spirit, that illness often arose from discord between a person and their proper place in the natural order, and that restoration of health required addressing these deeper imbalances as well as any physical ailments. The Druids served as the memory of their people in ways that went far beyond the preservation of laws and customs. They were the keepers of genealogy, able to trace the lineage of any noble family back through the mists of time to legendary ancestors whose deeds had shaped the very landscape of the Celtic world. They knew which bloodlines carried gifts of prophecy, which families had ancient obligations to guard particular sacred sites, which marriages would strengthen the bonds between tribes, and which might lead to conflict. In times of war, they served as diplomats and negotiators, their wisdom and impartiality making them ideal intermediaries between hostile factions. Their persons were considered sacred and inviolate. Even the most warlike Celtic warriors would not raise a hand against a Druid, knowing that to do so would bring not just earthly consequences, but spiritual catastrophe upon themselves and their descendants. This immunity allowed them to move freely between enemies, carrying messages and seeking peaceful solutions to conflicts that might otherwise have devastated entire regions. But perhaps most importantly, the Druids were the philosophers of their people, the ones who pondered the deepest questions of existence and meaning. In their groves, beneath stars that seemed to pulse with otherworldly intelligence, they explored mysteries that would later occupy the greatest minds of Greece and Rome. What was the nature of the soul? How did the seen world relate to the unseen? What obligations did human beings have to the earth that sustained them, to the ancestors who had gone before, to the generations yet to come? Their philosophical discussions were not abstract intellectual exercises, but practical explorations of how to live in harmony with the deepest truths of existence. They taught that the universe was fundamentally alive, that consciousness was not limited to human beings, but permeated every level of reality from the smallest grain of sand to the greatest celestial bodies. This meant that every action had consequences that rippled outward through networks of connection that spanned both space and time, making ethical behavior not just a social necessity, but a cosmic responsibility. The Druids understood education as transformation, not merely information transfer. Those who studied with them emerged, changed at the deepest levels. Their perception of reality expanded to encompass dimensions of experience that ordinary consciousness could barely glimpse. They learned to see patterns within patterns, to understand how individual events fit into vast cycles of cause and effect that played out over centuries or millennia. Their teaching methods reflected this understanding. Rather than lecturing, they guided their students through direct experience of the principles they wished to convey. A lesson about the interconnectedness of all life might involve spending days in solitary observation of a single tree, watching how it interacted with birds and insects, wind and rain, sun and moon, until the student began to perceive the web of relationships that sustained not just that one tree, but the entire forest of existence. They taught through story and symbol, understanding that truth often could not be captured in literal statements, but required metaphor and myth to convey its full richness. A tale about a hero's journey might simultaneously be a map of psychological development, a guide to spiritual transformation, a historical chronicle, and a key to understanding the movement of celestial bodies, all depending on the level of understanding the student had achieved. The wisdom of the Druids was not their personal possession, but a trust held on behalf of all Celtic peoples. They saw themselves as servants of something far greater than their individual lives, guardians of knowledge that belonged to the ancestors who had developed it, the communities that depended upon it, and the future generations who would need it to navigate challenges not yet imagined. This sense of stewardship shaped every aspect of their lives, making them simultaneously humble in the face of the vast mysteries they studied and confident in their role as carriers of sacred tradition. As morning gave way to midday, and the sacred grove filled with golden light that seemed to make every leaf and stone glow with inner fire, the Druids continued their eternal work of preserving and transmitting the wisdom that was the true treasure of the Celtic world, knowledge that could not be stolen by raiders or destroyed by fire, but lived in human hearts and minds as long as there were those dedicated enough to keep it alive. When winter's grip began to loosen, and the first tender shoots of mistletoe appeared as pale green promises against the dark bark of ancient oaks, the Druids knew that one of their most sacred seasons had arrived. The mistletoe, growing without roots in earth, yet thriving high among the branches, was to them a living symbol of the soul's ability to flourish independent of material constraints, a bridge between the earthly realm and the celestial spheres, where the gods dwelt in eternal splendor. The ritual of the mistletoe harvest was perhaps the most mystical of all Druidic ceremonies, performed on the 6th day after the new moon, when the pale plant seemed to glow with captured starlight among the winter branches. As dawn approached, the grove would fill with a sense of anticipation, so thick it seemed to shimmer in the morning air. The other trees, ash and birch, rowan and hazel, seemed to lean inward as if eager to witness this ancient rite that connected earth to sky through the sacred marriage of oak and mistletoe. A procession would form before first light, led by the chief Druid, whose white robes seemed to float rather than flow as they moved through the forest paths. Behind followed the other members of the order, their voices raised in chants so old that the words themselves seemed to come from the throat of the earth. The melody wove through the trees like morning mist, each note chosen for its ability to resonate with the natural frequencies of wood and stone, creating harmonics that could be felt as much as heard. At the base of the chosen oak, which had been selected through divination and careful observation of signs that only the most experienced Druids could interpret, the ceremony would begin with offerings to the tree spirits. Honey and milk were poured upon the roots, along with precious metals that would slowly leach into the soil to nourish the great oak for seasons to come. The Druids understood that nothing could be taken without something being given in return, that the sacred exchange of gift for gift maintained the balance that kept both human and natural worlds in harmony. The actual cutting of the mistletoe required implements that had never touched the earth, a golden sickle shaped by master craftsmen using techniques passed down through generations of metalworkers who understood that the tools used in sacred work must themselves be consecrated. The chief Druid would climb into the oak's branches, moving with the careful grace of one who knew that they were ascending not merely a tree, but a living ladder that connected the mundane world to realms of pure spirit. As the golden sickle touched the mistletoe, those gathered below would hold their breath, for this was the moment when the boundary between ordinary time and sacred time became permeable. The severed mistletoe would not be allowed to fall to the ground, where contact with earth would drain away its celestial properties, but was caught in a cloth of purest white that had been woven by hands that knew the secret songs that gave fabric its power to hold and channel spiritual energy. The harvested mistletoe would be divided according to ancient protocols, portions given to heal the sick, to bless marriages and births, to protect homes from malevolent spirits, and to create the potions and charms that were essential tools of the Druidic arts. But the most sacred portion would be reserved for the great seasonal festivals that marked the turning points of the year, when the veil between worlds grew thin and the Druids could work their greatest magic. Samhain, the festival that marked the end of harvest time and the beginning of the dark half of the year, was perhaps the most significant of these celebrations. As October waned and November approached, when the last fruits had been gathered and the herds brought down from summer pastures, when the trees stood bare against grey skies and the first frost silvered the meadows, the Druids would prepare for a night when the ancestors walked freely among the living, and the future cast shadows backward into the present. The preparations began days in advance, with sacred fires being kindled in every grove throughout the Celtic lands. These were not ordinary flames, but fires that had been lit using techniques that dated back to the dawn of human civilization, sparked by the friction of sacred woods and fed with plants that had been blessed and consecrated. The smoke that rose from these fires was said to carry prayers and offerings to the other world, creating pillars of communication that connected Earth to the realm where the gods held their councils. On the night of Samhain itself, the boundary between past and present dissolved like morning mist before the sun. The Druids would gather in their groves as darkness fell, their white robes making them visible as ghostly figures moving through the shadows. They carried torches whose flames danced with colors that had no names in any human language, blues that were deeper than sky, reds that pulsed like heartbeats, golds that seemed to hold the concentrated essence of all the sun's warmth and light. The ceremonies of Samhain were not celebrations in any ordinary sense, but profound workings that required years of training to perform safely. The Druids would open doorways between the worlds, allowing the spirits of the dead to return and share their wisdom with the living. Ancestors who had passed beyond the veil would materialize in the sacred circles, their forms translucent but unmistakably real, their voices carrying messages that could guide the living through the challenges of the coming year. These visitations were not random hauntings, but carefully orchestrated encounters. The Druids served as mediators, protecting the living from spirits who might mean harm, while ensuring that the ancestral wisdom could flow freely to those who needed it. They understood the protocols of the otherworld, knew which offerings would attract beneficial presences, and which words would send malevolent entities back to whatever dark corners they had emerged from. But Samhain was also a time of prophecy, when the future cast its shadow backward and those with the sight could glimpse what was to come. The Druids would enter deep trances, their consciousness traveling along pathways that wound through time like forest trails wind through trees. In these visionary states, they could see beyond the immediate moment to perceive the great patterns that shaped human destiny, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the movements of peoples across vast landscapes, the coming of new ages that would transform the world beyond recognition. As winter gave way to spring, the wheel of the year turned toward Beltaine, the festival of fire and fertility that celebrated the return of life to the land. Where Samhain had been a time of introspection and communion with the ancestors, Beltaine was a celebration of the present moment and the promise of future abundance. The very air seemed to crackle with energy as the earth awakened from its winter sleep, and the Druids channeled this resurgent power through ceremonies that blessed both human and natural fertility. The Beltaine fires were kindled, not in the shadowed depths of the groves, but on hilltops, where their light could be seen for miles around. These beacons served as signals that connected community to community across the Celtic lands, a network of flame that bound the scattered settlements together in shared celebration. Cattle would be driven between the fires to purify them and ensure their health and fertility in the coming year, while people would leap over the smaller flames to receive blessings of vitality and abundance. The festival lasted for 3 days and nights, during which the normal rules of society were relaxed and the boundaries between social classes became permeable. The Druids presided over these celebrations, not as stern judges, but as facilitators of joy, understanding that the return of life to the world deserved to be honored with laughter and music, dancing and feasting. Yet beneath the revelry lay deeper purposes, for Beltaine was also a time when marriages were blessed, when new ventures were begun, when the partnerships that would sustain communities through the coming year were formed and sanctified. The summer solstice brought its own unique ceremonies, focused on the moment when the sun reached the peak of its power and began the slow decline toward winter darkness. The Druids understood that this turning point was pregnant with significance, for it represented both the culmination of the year's growth and the beginning of its decline, the perfect balance point where light and shadow met in eternal dance. On the longest day of the year, they would gather at stone circles that had been ancient when their own traditions were young, megaliths that had been positioned with mathematical precision to frame the rising sun at this most sacred moment. As the first rays of solstice dawn struck the altar stones, the assembled Druids would raise their voices in songs that had been crafted to match the frequencies of the standing stones themselves, creating resonances that could be felt as much as heard. These ceremonies were not mere observations of natural phenomena, but active participations in the cosmic processes that governed all existence. The Druids believed that their rituals helped maintain the balance that kept the world stable, that without their intervention, the sun might fail to return from its northward journey, leaving the earth trapped in eternal winter. They saw themselves as partners with the gods in the ongoing work of creation, their ceremonies essential threads in the vast tapestry of forces that sustained all life. The changing seasons were marked by smaller festivals as well, each one honoring a particular aspect of the natural world's endless transformation. The first snowfall would be greeted with ceremonies that honored the spirits of winter, while the return of migrating birds would be celebrated with songs that welcomed them back from their otherworldly journeys. Every full moon brought its own rituals, each new moon its own observances, creating a rhythm of sacred time that gave meaning and structure to the ordinary flow of days and nights. Through all these ceremonies, the mistletoe remained a constant presence, its evergreen branches serving as reminders that life persisted even in the depths of winter, that the connection between earth and sky could never be truly severed. The Druids would wear sprigs of it in their hair during the most sacred rituals, understanding that they carried within themselves the same ability to flourish independent of material limitations, to draw sustenance from sources that transcended the physical world. As twilight settled over the sacred groves and the last embers of the festival fires glowed like fallen stars among the trees, the Druids would gather the implements of ceremony and store them away until the wheel of the year brought the next sacred season. But the power they had channeled would linger in the grove, soaking into the earth like rainfall, rising with the sap of trees, flowing outward through root and stream and wind to bless all the lands where Celtic peoples made their homes. In the moments before dawn, when darkness held its deepest embrace and the first birds had not yet stirred to song, the grove would fill with a presence that transformed the very quality of air and shadow. This was the hour when the Druids served as voices for powers that existed beyond human understanding, when they became channels through which the gods could speak to mortal ears, and mortal concerns could be carried to divine attention. The boundary between earth and sky, between human and divine, became as permeable as morning mist, and through this opening flowed communications that would shape the destiny of individuals and entire tribes. The Druids understood that the gods did not dwell in some distant heaven, separate from the world of daily life, but were woven into the very fabric of existence itself. Every spring bubbling from hidden depths carried messages from the earth goddess. Every wind that stirred the leaves whispered secrets from the sky father. Every flame that danced upon sacred altars flickered with the presence of the god of light and inspiration. To commune with these divine forces required not prayers sent upward to an unreachable realm, but a deep listening to voices that surrounded them always, speaking in languages that most mortals had forgotten how to understand. The practice of augury was central to this divine communication, for the Druids had learned over countless generations to read the signs that the gods wrote across the natural world. The flight of birds held particular significance, each species carrying its own sacred message depending on the season, the direction of travel, the height at which they flew, and dozens of other subtle factors that only the most experienced augur could interpret correctly. Ravens, black as shadows and wise as winter nights, brought messages from the other world and warnings of changes to come. Eagles, soaring high above earthly concerns, carried the perspectives of the gods themselves and could reveal the long-term consequences of present actions. Hawks spoke of conflict and resolution, their keen eyes reflecting divine judgment, while swans, graceful as they moved between air and brought messages of love and transformation. The Druids would spend hours in patient observation, watching the patterns of bird flight against cloud-painted skies, noting which trees they chose for perching, listening to the subtle variations in their calls that revealed meanings invisible to untrained ears. A single raven's cry at dawn might warn of treachery in the council chamber, while the sight of eagles circling a particular hill could indicate divine approval for a planned battle or disapproval of a proposed marriage alliance. But the gods spoke through more than winged messengers. The Druids read divine will in the movement of clouds across star-scattered skies, in the patterns of foam left by retreating waves, in the way smoke rose from sacred fires, and the shapes it formed as it drifted upward toward the realm of spirits. They understood that every natural phenomenon was simultaneously itself and a symbol, existing on multiple levels of meaning that could be decoded by those who had learned to see with eyes trained by decades of careful study. Thunder was the voice of the sky god, expressing pleasure or displeasure with human actions, while lightning revealed the pathways along which divine power flowed through the landscape. The Druids would map these celestial roads, marking the places where lightning had struck repeatedly, and understanding them as points where the divine realm touched most closely upon the earthly. These spots became sacred sites, where the gods could be approached with greater certainty of receiving an answer, where prayers had more power and prophecies came with clearer vision. The reading of entrails was perhaps the most direct form of divine communication, though it was practiced only by the most senior Druids, and only when the need was great enough to justify the sacrifice of a sacred animal. The gods, they believed, could write their will upon the organs of creatures offered in their honor, creating patterns in liver and heart, lung and kidney that revealed not just future events, but the divine reasoning behind them. These sacrifices were conducted with profound reverence and careful ritual, the animals chosen for their perfection and prepared through ceremonies that honored their role as messengers between worlds. The Druid who performed such divination would enter a trance state before beginning, their consciousness expanding to encompass perspectives that transcended ordinary human awareness. In this altered state, the patterns revealed by the sacrifice would unfold like illuminated manuscripts, showing not just what would happen, but why it must happen. How present choices led inevitably to future consequences, and what actions might be taken to work with divine will rather than against it. Such knowledge came with tremendous responsibility, for to know the future was to bear the burden of guiding others through the challenges that lay ahead. Prophecy flowed through Druidic consciousness like water through underground channels, emerging sometimes as clear vision and sometimes as cryptic utterances that would only be understood when the prophesied events came to pass. The gods spoke through human voices, but in their own language, using symbols and metaphors that compressed vast truths into forms that unmortal minds could contain without being shattered by the weight of divine knowledge. A prophecy might speak of wolves walking in daylight, which could mean literal danger from wild beasts, or symbolic warning about enemies who hid their true nature beneath friendly facades. The Druids trained themselves to become perfect vessels for these divine communications, purifying their minds through meditation and their bodies through careful attention to diet and ritual cleanliness. They understood that prophecy required not just natural gift, but cultivated receptivity, the ability to set aside personal desires and fears in order to allow divine truth to flow through human consciousness without distortion. The greatest prophets among them were those who had learned to disappear completely in the moment of revelation, becoming transparent channels through which the gods could speak directly to those who sought guidance. But divine communication was not a one-way flow from gods to humans. The Druids also served as advocates for their people, carrying human concerns to divine attention through rituals of petition and offering. They understood that the gods, powerful as they were, still valued the worship and acknowledgement of mortals, still desired the incense that rose from sacred fires and the songs that lifted human voices in praise and supplication. The relationship between human and divine was one of mutual exchange, gifts flowing in both directions across the boundary that separated earthly and celestial realms. The most complex of these exchanges involved the great seasonal sacrifices, when entire communities would gather to honor the gods who governed the cycles of death and renewal that sustained all life. These were not simple transactions, offerings given in hope of receiving specific benefits in return, but profound ceremonies of participation in the cosmic processes that kept the world in balance. The Druids understood that the gods required not just material offerings, but emotional and spiritual engagement, the commitment of entire communities to the sacred work of maintaining harmony between human desires and natural law. Sacred groves served as temples for these divine communications, but temples unlike any that would be built in later ages. Here there were no walls to separate human from divine, no roof to block the flow of energy between earth and sky. The trees themselves served as pillars, their branches forming natural galleries where the voices of gods could resonate without obstruction. The altar was not a human construction, but a natural clearing where grass grew in patterns that revealed divine preferences, where springs bubbled with water that carried messages from the depths of the earth. In these outdoor sanctuaries, the Druids would kindle fires that served as beacons calling divine attention to human needs. The flames would dance with colors that had meaning to trained eyes, blue for water and emotional healing, green for earth and material abundance, gold for air and intellectual inspiration, red for fire and spiritual transformation. The gods would respond to these signals by sending signs that the Druids could interpret. Sudden shifts in wind direction, changes in the behavior of sacred animals, variations in the quality of light that filtered through the canopy overhead. The most profound divine communications came during the great trance ceremonies, when senior Druids would journey beyond ordinary consciousness to meet the gods directly in their own realm. These were dangerous undertakings that required years of preparation and could only be attempted by those who had proven their ability to navigate between worlds without losing their way. The Druid would drink sacred potions brewed from plants that opened doorways in perception, would breathe smoke from fires fed with specially prepared herbs, would dance to rhythms that matched the heartbeat of the earth itself until their individual consciousness dissolved into the greater awareness that connected all things. In these visionary states, communication with the gods became direct and immediate, no longer requiring interpretation of symbols or signs, but consisting of pure exchange of understanding. The Druid would return from such journeys, bearing knowledge that could guide their people through crises that had not yet arrived, carrying warnings of invasions from across the sea, or bringing instructions for new rituals that would help their communities adapt to changing times. But the cost of such journeys was high, for each trip to the divine realm left the traveler more detached from ordinary human concerns, more attuned to cosmic patterns than to daily needs. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the sacred grove, painting the mist with shades of gold and silver, the gods would gradually withdraw their immediate presence, leaving behind only whispers in the wind and shadows that seemed to hold memories of divine visitation. The Druids would gather the signs and omens they had received, the prophecies and warnings, the blessings and guidance that had flowed from celestial to earthly realms, and would begin the work of translating divine will into human action, ensuring that the voices of the gods continued to echo through every decision made by those who sought to live in harmony with the sacred patterns that governed all existence. In the deepest hours of night, when stars wheeled overhead like silver wheels of fire, and the sacred groves resonated with whispers from realms beyond mortal sight, the Druids would gather their listeners close and begin to weave the tales that carried within them the very soul of the Celtic world. These were not mere entertainments to pass the dark hours, but living repositories of wisdom that held the keys to understanding both human nature and the divine forces that shaped destiny. Each story was a seed that could sprout differently in each listener's mind, growing into lessons that would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The greatest of these tales spoke of Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, whose very name sent shivers through both mortal and immortal realms. Picture him as the Druids painted him with their words, a young warrior of impossible beauty and terrible power, his hair dark as raven's wing, his eyes shifting from grey to blue to green like storm clouds over the sea. 7 pupils blazed in each eye when the battle fury came upon him, and his very presence could make horses rear and birds fall silent in their flight. But Cuchulainn was more than mortal, for his father was Lu of the Long Arm, the shining god who ruled over skill and craft, poetry and war. This divine heritage marked the hero from birth, blessing him with abilities that transcended human limitations, while binding him to a fate that no mortal will could alter. The Druids who first told his tale understood that they spoke not merely of one man's deeds, but of the eternal struggle between light and shadow, order and chaos that played out in every human heart. The Táin Bó Cúailnge, the great cattle raid of Cooley, was the canvas upon which this cosmic drama unfolded. Queen Medb of Connaught, driven by pride and ancient jealousy, had assembled an army greater than any seen before to steal the brown bull of Cooley from Ulster. But the men of Ulster lay under an ancient curse, struck down by weakness when they were needed most, leaving only Cuchulainn to stand against the tide of war that threatened to engulf his homeland. Picture the young hero standing alone at the ford of Ardee, morning mist swirling around his feet, his chariot gleaming with bronze and gold, his spears thirsting for battle. Behind him lay the hills of Ulster, where his people suffered under the curse that bound them to their beds of pain. Before him stretched the army of Connaught, warriors from every corner of Ireland, their weapons glinting like scales on some vast serpent that undulated across the landscape. For 3 months, Cuchulainn held the ford, honouring the ancient laws of single combat that even Queen Medb dared not break. Day after day, champion after champion came forward to face him, and day after day, the Hound of Ulster sent them to the Shadowlands, where the dead hold council with their ancestors. His chariot driver Laeg would wash the blood from the wheels each evening, while the horses of the god-touched champion, the grey of Matcha and the black of Sainglend, would paw the earth with hooves that struck sparks from stone. When the warrior frenzy seized him, Cuchulainn became something beyond human recognition. His body would contort in ways that defied nature, one eye sinking deep into his skull, while the other protruded like a blood-red coal. His hair stood on end, with each strand tipped with fire or blood, while his feet and hands twisted backward to give him the aspect of a creature from the other world. Steam rose from his limbs like smoke from a forge, and the very air around him shimmered with heat that could melt snow for a mile in every direction. Yet it was not his physical prowess alone that made Cuchulainn legendary among the Druids, but his connection to the mystical forces that governed both war and fate. He could hear the voices of the battle goddesses, the 3 Moringa who appeared sometimes as ravens croaking prophecy over battlefields, sometimes as crones washing armor in the streams that ran red with blood, sometimes as beautiful women offering love to warriors about to die. The greatest of these was the Morrigan herself, the Phantom Queen whose very presence could turn the tide of battle. She came to Cuchulainn in many forms throughout his brief and blazing career, sometimes as an eel writhing around his legs as he fought in the ford, sometimes as a red heifer leading a stampede of cattle toward his position, sometimes as a crow perched upon his shoulder, whispering secrets of victory and doom. She offered him her love and her power, but Cuchulainn, bound by oaths and honor, could never fully accept what she offered, though her gifts might have changed the fate of all Ireland. The Druids who preserved these tales understood that the Morrigan represented more than mere warfare. She was the voice of sovereignty itself, the power that chose kings and toppled dynasties, the force that transformed boys into heroes and heroes into legends. Her relationship with Cuchulainn embodied the eternal tension between human will and divine purpose, between the desire for control and the necessity of surrender to forces greater than any individual understanding. In one of the most haunting episodes of the great tale, Cuchulainn encountered the Morrigan at the ford of the river Unius, where she appeared as an old woman milking a cow with 3 teats. 3 times she offered him drinks from her vessels, and 3 times he blessed her, healing wounds he had earlier inflicted when she had opposed him in battle. The Druids who told this story by firelight understood its deeper meaning, that even the greatest hero must sometimes show mercy to his enemies, that blessing can transform curse, that the cycles of injury and healing are what bind the world together. Other tales wove through the Druidic tradition like golden threads through dark cloth, each one illuminating different aspects of the relationship between mortal and immortal realms. They spoke of Oisin, the poet-warrior who followed Niamh of the golden hair to the land of youth beyond the western waves, where 300 years passed like 3 days of music and laughter. When homesickness finally drew him back to Ireland, he found his companions long dead and his world transformed, touching the earth only to crumble into the dust of centuries. The Druids saw in Oisin's tale a meditation on the nature of time itself, on the price of immortality and the weight of memory. They understood that those who traffic with the other world must pay in the currency of loss, that every gift from the realm of the gods carries within it the seeds of its own withdrawal. Oisin's poetry, composed in the shadow of infinite regret, became the voice of all who have loved deeply and lost completely. Then there was Brigid, the triple goddess whose fire burned in forge and hearth and inspiration, whose wells bubbled with the waters of poetry and healing. Half goddess and half saint in later tellings, she embodied the transformative power of creativity, the divine spark that could turn base metal into gold, rough words into verse that moved hearts to tears or laughter, broken bodies into wholeness. The Druids honored her as the patron of all who worked with fire and word, understanding that creation itself was a form of magic that partook of divine power. The children of Lear, transformed by jealous magic into swans that sang with human voices of sorrow and loss, became symbols of the soul's journey through suffering toward eventual redemption. For 900 years they flew between lake and sea and lonely shore, their songs carrying such beauty that listeners would forget hunger and thirst, forget all earthly concerns in the presence of music that seemed to flow directly from the well springs of sorrow in the human heart. Each tale carried multiple layers of meaning, like the rings within the sacred oaks. On the surface, they were stories of adventure and romance, conflict and resolution. But deeper currents ran beneath these surface narratives, teachings about the nature of honor and sacrifice, the price of power, the relationship between human ambition and divine will. The Druids understood that their listeners would take from each story what they needed for their particular moment in life, that the same tale might comfort a child, guide a warrior, or inspire a poet, depending on the wisdom hunger that brought them to the fire circle. As the night deepened and the sacred flames threw dancing shadows on the faces of the gathered listeners, the Druids would weave these individual tales into larger patterns, showing how the adventures of heroes reflected the cosmic dramas that played out on scales too vast for ordinary human comprehension. The battle between Cuchulainn and the armies of Connacht became a symbol for the eternal struggle between order and chaos. The journey of Oisin to the otherworld and back again mapped the path of the soul through incarnation and return. The transformation of Lear's children illustrated the alchemy of suffering that could transmute pain into beauty. These were not stories to be heard once and forgotten, but living texts that grew richer with each retelling, deeper with each contemplation. The Druids understood that myth was not falsehood, but a higher form of truth, one that could contain contradictions and paradoxes that would shatter logical discourse. In the realm of story, heroes could be simultaneously mortal and divine. Events could be both historical and timeless. Characters could embody abstract principles while remaining vividly human. The tales themselves became a form of magic, words woven together with such skill that they could transport listeners across barriers of time and space, could make the long dead live again in imagination, could kindle in human hearts the fires of courage and compassion that were necessary to face whatever darkness might come. As dawn approached, and the last embers of the sacred fire settled into glowing coals, the echoes of these stories would linger in the grove like incense, blessing all who had listened with the enduring power of the imagination transformed into wisdom. As the mists of dawn lifted from the ancient landscape, like veils drawn back from sleeping faces, they revealed monuments that had stood since the world was young. Circles of stone that rose from the earth, like prayers made manifest in granite and sandstone, their weathered surfaces bearing witness to ceremonies older than written memory. These were the sacred sites where earth touched sky, where the Druids came to commune with forces that dwelt in the spaces between the visible stars, where the great patterns that governed all existence could be read in the precise alignments of megalith and celestial light. Picture Stonehenge as it stood in the days when Druidic voices still echoed between its trilithons, when the sarsen stones gleamed white as bone in the moonlight, and the smaller bluestones hummed with energies that had travelled hundreds of miles from their birthplace in the Welsh mountains. This was not merely a monument, but a living instrument, a vast stone harp whose strings were the invisible lines of force that connected Earth to the wheeling cosmos above. The Druids understood that it had been ancient, even when their own traditions were young, built by peoples whose names had been forgotten, but whose wisdom lived on in the careful mathematics of stone placement. The great circle was oriented with precision that would amaze modern astronomers, its axis pointing towards the spot on the horizon where the sun would rise on the morning of the summer solstice. But this was only the most obvious of its celestial alignments, for the monument also tracked the complex movements of the moon through its intricate cycle of phases and positions, marking the points where Earth's silver companion reached its furthest wanderings north and south of the celestial equator. Other stones framed the rising and setting of particular stars, creating a calendar written in stone that could track not just seasons, but the great cycles that stretched across centuries and millennia. The Druids who gathered at such sites understood that they stood at focal points of cosmic energy, places where the invisible architecture of the universe became temporarily visible to those who knew how to look. They saw the stone circles not as dead monuments, but as living beings, entities possessed of their own consciousness and will, capable of channeling and amplifying the subtle forces that flowed between earth and sky. Each stone had its own personality and purpose, its own voice in the great symphony of energies that played constantly across the landscape, for those with ears to hear it. When the moon was dark and the veil between worlds grew thin, the Druids would come to these circles, carrying torches whose flames seemed to burn with colors that had no names in mortal tongues. They understood that their ceremonies were not separate from the astronomical events they witnessed, but were essential parts of the same cosmic process, human consciousness joining its voice to the music of the spheres in harmonies that helped maintain the balance between order and chaos that kept the world stable. At Newgrange, older than Stonehenge and more mysterious still, the Druids inherited a monument that captured the light of the winter solstice in its stone embrace, channeling the first rays of the returning sun through a precisely engineered passage to illuminate a chamber deep within the heart of the mound. For exactly 17 minutes on the shortest day of the year, golden light would penetrate the darkness, striking carved spirals that seemed to writhe and dance in the sudden illumination, awakening symbols that spoke of death and rebirth, of the eternal cycle that carried souls from life to afterlife, and back again. The passage grave at Newgrange was not merely a tomb, but a machine for transformation, a place where the boundary between life and death became permeable under the influence of precisely timed celestial events. The Druids who conducted ceremonies within its stone chambers understood that they participated in mysteries that connected the fate of individual souls to the great cosmic cycles that governed the birth and death of stars, the rise and fall of civilizations, the endless dance of creation and destruction that was the heartbeat of existence itself. Other stone circles dotted the landscape like scattered jewels, each one positioned according to principles that married earthly geography to celestial mechanics with breathtaking precision. Avebury, with its vast earthen ramparts and multiple stone rings, created a complex instrument for tracking the movements of multiple celestial bodies simultaneously. The Ring of Brodgar in the Orkney Islands stood like a crown upon a narrow isthmus between lochs that reflected the sky, creating a perfect marriage of terrestrial and celestial water that amplified the site's power to serve as a window between worlds. The Druids understood that these monuments had been positioned not randomly, but according to a grand design that took into account not just local astronomical considerations, but the subtle energies that flowed along invisible pathways across the landscape. They mapped these energy lines with the same precision that they charted the courses of planets, understanding that the Earth itself was alive and conscious, its vital forces flowing along channels that could be detected by those who knew the proper techniques for such work. Standing stones served as acupuncture needles in the body of the Earth, marking points where these energy currents came close to the surface, where they could be tapped and directed by those who understood the principles involved. The Druids would place their hands upon these ancient stones and feel the pulse of the earth itself, the slow heartbeat that synchronized with the movements of moon and planets, the deeper rhythms that connected their small island to the vast cosmos that surrounded it. The mathematics encoded in these stone circles revealed knowledge that would not be rediscovered by European civilization for thousands of years. The builders had understood advanced principles of geometry and astronomy, had been able to calculate the complex cycles that governed eclipses, had known how to predict the movements of celestial bodies with accuracy that rivals modern computer calculations. But more than that, they had understood how to embed this knowledge in stone monuments that would preserve it across the rise and fall of countless civilizations. The Druids who inherited these sites saw themselves as custodians of wisdom that belonged not to any single culture, but to humanity itself. They understood that the stone circles were libraries built to last until the end of time, their information encoded not in fragile parchment or clay tablets, but in the eternal language of stone and starlight, mathematical relationships that would remain true as long as the Earth continued to spin on its axis and orbit around the Sun. Within the circles, ceremonies took on dimensions that transcended ordinary human experience. The stones seemed to amplify not just sound, but consciousness itself, allowing individual awareness to expand beyond the boundaries of personal identity, to encompass the vast perspectives that belonged to landscape and sky. Druids conducting rituals within these sacred spaces would feel their individual minds dissolving into group consciousness, their personal concerns melting away as they became conduits for forces that operated on scales measured in geological epochs rather than human lifetimes. The most profound of these ceremonies took place during astronomical events that occurred only rarely. Eclipses when sun and moon danced together in the sky, conjunctions when planets gathered like counselors in cosmic conference, the procession of equinoxes that marked the slow wobble of the Earth's axis across spans of time that dwarfed recorded history. On such occasions, the stone circles would become theatres for dramas that played out simultaneously on Earth and in the heavens, human actions mirroring celestial events in rituals that helped maintain the harmony between microcosm and macrocosm. The Druids understood that consciousness itself was part of the cosmic machinery, that human awareness wasn't separate from the forces that moved planets in their orbits, but was itself one of the fundamental powers that kept the universe operating according to its divine plan. Their ceremonies within the stone circles were not merely symbolic gestures, but active participations in the ongoing work of creation, helping to weave the threads of intention and attention that held the fabric of reality together. As generations passed and the original builders of the monuments faded into legend, the Druids adapted and enhanced the ancient sites according to their own understanding of cosmic principles. They carved new symbols into existing stones, added wooden posts and earthworks that aligned with celestial events that the original designers had not considered, modified the energy flows through careful placement of offerings and ritual implements. Yet they always worked in harmony with what had come before, understanding that they were part of a tradition that stretched back to the dawn of human consciousness, that their own contributions to the ancient sites were temporary modifications in an ongoing conversation between earth and sky that would continue long after their own names had been forgotten. The stone circles represented humanity's oldest and most enduring attempt to create permanent dialogue with the cosmos, monuments to the eternal human desire to understand our place in the vast machinery of existence that surrounds and sustains us. As the sun reached its zenith and flooded the ancient monuments with golden light that revealed every carved spiral and weathered edge, the stones stood silent, yet somehow expectant, waiting for the next phase of the eternal dance between earthly consciousness and celestial power that had been their purpose since the world was young. The first rumors came like shadows before the storm, whispered tales carried by merchants along the ancient trade routes that connected the Celtic lands to the wider world beyond. Roman legions were moving north through Gaul, their eagles glinting in the sunlight as they marched in formations that ate up miles with mechanical precision. The Druids, gathered in their sacred groves beneath oaks that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless generations, listened to these reports with growing unease, for their prophets had long foreseen that a time of great change was approaching, when the old ways would face their greatest test. Julius Caesar himself would later write of these encounters, his words preserved in scrolls that painted the Druids in shades of both admiration and fear. He described them as wielding influence that transcended the boundaries between tribes, as teachers whose authority was recognized from the mists of Britain to the sun-baked hills of southern Gaul. But he also saw in them a threat to Roman order, a source of resistance that couldn't be conquered by sword and shield alone, but required the systematic destruction of the beliefs and practices that gave Celtic society its spiritual foundation. Picture Caesar as he might have appeared to Druidic eyes when he first encountered their power during the conquest of Gaul. Here was a man driven by ambitions that burned like forge fire, whose mind worked with the precision of a military machine, who saw the world as territory to be conquered and peoples as obstacles to be overcome or tools to be employed. He carried within him the weight of Roman civilization, with its roads and laws, its temples and taxation, its vision of order imposed upon the chaos of barbarian lands. Yet even Caesar could not entirely dismiss the power he witnessed in the Druidic groves. He wrote of rituals that could bind warriors to fight beyond death, of prophecies that came true with unsettling accuracy, of ceremonies that seemed to channel forces beyond Roman understanding. His accounts, filtered through the lens of Roman prejudice and political necessity, still preserved echoes of genuine awe at powers that his own traditions could not explain or easily counter. The Druids' reaction to the Roman advance was complex, for they had long known through their star lore and prophecy that this confrontation was inevitable. Some saw in the Romans a test that the Celtic peoples must pass to prove their worthiness to continue as guardians of the ancient wisdom. Others read in the flight of birds and the patterns of cloud and flame that the time of the groves was ending, that the wheel of ages was turning toward a new phase where different powers would hold sway over the affairs of mortals. In the sacred council that gathered at the great grove near Chartres, representatives from across the Celtic world met to discuss how they should respond to this Roman threat. The debates lasted for days and nights, with Druids speaking not just for their own tribes, but as voices of the land itself, interpreters of divine will, whose words carried weight that transcended merely human authority. Some argued for accommodation, believing that the Romans could be taught to respect the sacred sites and ancient laws if approached with proper wisdom. Others called for resistance unto death, declaring that some things were more precious than life itself and must be defended no matter the cost. The most profound discussions centered not on tactics of war, but on the nature of change itself. The eldest Druids, whose memories reached back through generations of oral tradition, reminded their colleagues that civilizations rose and fell like seasons, that even the mightiest empire must eventually crumble before forces it could not understand or control. They taught that the true test was not whether the Celtic peoples could defeat Rome in battle, but whether they could preserve the essential wisdom through whatever transformations lay ahead. Some Druids, gifted with the sight that could peer beyond the veils of time, spoke of visions where Roman eagles perched in sacred groves, where Latin prayers replaced Celtic chants, where the ancient stones stood empty and forgotten, while new gods claimed the devotion of the peoples who had forgotten their true names. But they also saw deeper currents flowing beneath these surface changes, streams of wisdom that would go underground like hidden rivers, emerging in new forms when the time was right for their return. Caesar's accounts of specific encounters with Druidic power reveal both his Roman pragmatism and his grudging recognition of forces that challenged his world view. He wrote of a siege where Celtic warriors fought with supernatural courage, seeming to draw strength from invisible sources that Roman military science could not account for. He described negotiations where Druidic ambassadors spoke with authority that transcended their apparent political position, as if they represented powers greater than any earthly kingdom. Most unsettling to Caesar were the reports of Druidic prophecies concerning his own fate and that of Rome itself. The Druids spoke of eagles that would fly higher than ever before, yet would eventually fall to earth with broken wings, of an empire that would grow until it encompassed the known world, yet would carry within itself the seeds of its own destruction. They prophesied that the very success of Roman arms would breed the weaknesses that would ultimately unmake Roman power, that conquest would bring corruption, that order imposed by force would eventually collapse into chaos more complete than any that had existed before. Such prophecies struck deep into Caesar's mind, for they touched upon fears that haunted even the most successful Roman leaders. The empire was already showing signs of the internal conflicts that would eventually tear it apart, and Caesar himself was acutely aware that his own position depended upon a delicate balance of political forces that could shift without warning. The Druidic ability to see patterns hidden from ordinary perception made their warnings impossible to dismiss, even when accepting them would have required Caesar to question the fundamental assumptions upon which his entire career was built. The systematic destruction of the Druidic groves began not as mere military necessity, but as a kind of spiritual warfare. Roman materialism set against Celtic mysticism in a conflict that would determine which vision of reality would shape the future of Western civilization. Caesar ordered the sacred trees cut down and burned, the stone circles defaced, the wells polluted, understanding instinctively that the physical destruction of holy sites would strike deeper than any battlefield victory at the spiritual foundations of Celtic resistance. Yet the Druids had prepared for such attacks, having foreseen through their arts of divination that the sacred sites would face desecration. They had already begun the great work of preservation, memorizing not just the traditional lore, but the essential patterns that underlay it, the mathematical relationships that governed the placement of stones, the astronomical calculations that tracked the movements of celestial bodies, the herbal knowledge that could heal both body and spirit. This wisdom they carried within themselves, like seeds that could sprout in new soil when the proper season arrived. The most poignant accounts from this period speak of Druids standing in their burning groves, chanting the ancient songs one last time as Roman axes bit into wood that had been sacred for 1,000 years. They understood that they witnessed not just the end of their own tradition, but the closing of an entire age of human relationship with the natural world, the triumph of a vision that saw the earth as resource to be exploited rather than sacred presence to be honored. Some Druids chose to die with their groves, believing that their spirits would join the guardian forces that protected the sacred sites even after the physical structures had been destroyed. Others accepted the bitter task of survival, carrying their knowledge into exile on islands where Roman power could not reach, or going underground within the very communities that had been conquered, disguising their teachings as folklore and custom that Roman administrators would overlook as harmless superstition. The irony that would only become apparent with the passage of centuries was that Roman destruction of the Druidic groves would eventually contribute to the preservation of Celtic wisdom in forms that might otherwise have been lost. Forced to adapt to new circumstances, the surviving Druids developed techniques for encoding their knowledge in stories and songs that could survive even when their original contexts were forgotten. The myths and legends that we know today are often these encoded teachings, wisdom preserved in amber of narrative for future generations to discover and decode. As the smoke rose from burning groves across Gaul and Britain, carrying with it the end of an age, both Romans and Celts understood that they had participated in something more significant than mere conquest. They had witnessed the collision of two fundamentally different ways of understanding human relationship to the cosmos, two visions of what civilization could become. The immediate victory belonged to Rome, but the Druids had planted seeds that would flower in times and places that even their prophetic sight could not clearly envision. Beyond the reach of Roman legions, where grey seas crashed against cliffs that seemed to hold up the very dome of sky, lay islands wrapped in mist and legend. Sanctuaries where the ancient wisdom could still flow as freely as the tides that surrounded them. Chief among these was Anglesey, which the Druids called Muna, the sacred island, where their most hallowed groves grew in soil that had never felt the tread of conqueror's boot, where the old songs still echoed across waters that reflected not just sky, but the memories of ages when the world was young. Picture this island as it appeared to approaching pilgrims in the years before Rome's shadow fell across the Celtic lands, a realm of shifting mists where the boundary between earthly and otherworldly grew thin as gossamer, where ancient groves of oak and ash crowded down to shores that seemed to pulse with their own mysterious tides. The very air tasted of salt and sanctity, while springs bubbled from hidden depths, carrying waters that were said to grant vision to those pure enough in heart to drink from them. Anglesey had been sacred since time beyond memory, chosen by the earliest Druids as their principal sanctuary because of qualities that went far beyond its obvious strategic advantages. The island sat at the crossing of invisible currents that flowed through both earth and sea, a place where multiple streams of cosmic energy converged like rivers, joining to form a mighty flood. Those sensitive to such forces could feel them humming in the ground beneath their feet, singing in the wind that swept across the narrow straits, pulsing in the rhythm of waves against the sacred shores. Here the Druids had built their greatest college, a centre of learning that drew students from across the Celtic world and beyond. Young men and women would travel for months through dangerous territories to reach this island sanctuary, where they would spend the best years of their lives mastering traditions that stretched back to the dawn of human consciousness. The education they received on Mona was far more than mere accumulation of facts. It was a complete transformation of consciousness that prepared them to serve as bridges between the world of ordinary experience and the realm of eternal truths. The sacred groves of Anglesey were arranged according to principles that married astronomy to sacred geometry, creating a vast natural temple whose altars were clearings carpeted with flowers that bloomed according to celestial schedules. Each grove specialized in particular aspects of Druidic learning, one for the healing arts, where students learned to read the subtle energies that flowed through human bodies and to channel the curative powers that dwelt in plant and stone and song. Another for the arts of prophecy, where initiates trained their inner sight to perceive the patterns that connected present actions to future consequences. The greatest of these groves was dedicated to the preservation of the genealogies and historical chronicles that formed the backbone of Celtic identity. Here, beneath oaks whose age was measured in millennia, the master bards would recite the great cycles of stories that held within them not just entertainment, but the essential wisdom of their people. Students would spend years memorizing these vast repositories of knowledge, learning not just the words, but the subtle variations in tone and emphasis that could unlock different levels of meaning hidden within familiar tales. But Anglesey was more than just a school. It was the beating heart of Druidic power, the place where the great councils met to make decisions that would affect the destiny of Celtic peoples across the known world. Representatives would come from as far away as Ireland and the mountains of Galatia, carrying with them the concerns of their communities and the wisdom gleaned from their local traditions. In the great council grove, beneath the spreading branches of an oak that was old when Caesar was young, these gatherings would deliberate questions that touched upon the deepest mysteries of existence. The island's sanctity was protected by more than geographical isolation. The Druids had woven around Mona layers of spiritual protection that made it invisible to hostile intent, that turned aside the minds of those who approached with thoughts of conquest or desecration. Roman ships sailing through the narrow straits might pass within sight of the sacred shores, yet see nothing but empty coastline, their crews experiencing sudden urges to look elsewhere, to concern themselves with other destinations. This protection held for generations, allowing the Druidic traditions to flourish on Anglesey, even as Roman power spread across the mainland. The island became a repository not just of Celtic wisdom, but of knowledge from many lands, fragments of Greek philosophy brought by traders, mathematical insights from Babylonian astronomers, healing techniques from the mystery schools of Egypt. The Druids understood that truth belonged to no single people, but was the common heritage of all humanity, and they welcomed genuine seekers regardless of their origins. The daily life of the island followed rhythms that harmonized human activity with natural cycles in ways that seemed miraculous to visitors from the increasingly artificial environments of Roman cities. Work and study, prayer and contemplation, celebration and solitude all flowed together in patterns that honored both the needs of human community and the deeper requirements of spiritual development. Students learned not just through formal instruction, but through participation in the island's communal life, discovering how wisdom could be embodied in the simplest daily tasks. The sacred fires that burned continuously in the island's temples were tended by Druids whose lives had been dedicated to this single responsibility. These flames had been kindled from embers that tradition claimed came from the first fire ever lit by human hands, and they were fed only with woods that had been blessed according to rituals that ensured their purity. The smoke that rose from these eternal fires was said to carry prayers and offerings to the realm where the gods held council, creating a permanent line of communication between earthly and celestial realms. When Suetonius Paulinus finally brought Roman legions across the Menai Strait in the year that would mark the beginning of the end for Druidic power, he found an island that defied every Roman assumption about barbarian society. Instead of crude settlements and savage warriors, he encountered a civilization of sophistication that rivaled anything Rome had produced, a community organized around principles that prioritized wisdom over wealth, harmony over dominance, spiritual development over material accumulation. The Roman accounts of the assault on Anglesey, written by men who had convinced themselves they fought against primitive superstition, nonetheless reveal their amazement at what they found. They wrote of groves that seemed to glow with inner light, of standing stones that hummed with mysterious energies, of wells whose waters reflected not just the sky above, but visions of times and places far removed from the immediate present. They described Druids who faced death with such composure that even hardened legionaries felt their certainty wavering. The destruction of the sacred groves on Anglesey was conducted with systematic thoroughness that spoke to Roman understanding of what they were destroying. This was not mere military conquest, but cultural genocide, the deliberate obliteration of a way of life that challenged fundamental Roman assumptions about power and progress. The trees were not simply cut down, but uprooted, their very roots burned to ensure that no new growth could spring from the consecrated soil. Yet even as the physical structures of Druidic power crumbled before Roman efficiency, something essential escaped destruction. In the final hours before the legions landed, boats slipped away from Anglesey's hidden coves, carrying not just refugees, but the living essence of what the island had represented. These vessels bore human libraries, whose minds contained the accumulated wisdom of centuries, whose memories preserved not just facts, but the inner understanding that gave those facts their power to transform consciousness. Some sailed west toward Ireland, where other sanctuaries awaited beyond the reach of Roman ambition. Others sought refuge in the wild highlands of Scotland, where mist and mountain would provide protection for traditions that needed time to adapt to a world transformed beyond recognition. Still others went underground within the conquered territories themselves, disguising their knowledge as folk wisdom, encoding their deepest teachings in stories that would survive even when their original contexts were forgotten. The island that Suetonius left behind was empty of human life, but not of deeper significance. The springs still bubbled with waters that remembered the prayers spoken over them through countless generations. The stones still hummed with energies that transcended human understanding. The very soil remained consecrated by the countless rituals that had been performed upon it, holding within its dark embrace the potential for renewal that would wait patiently for the proper season of return. Anglesey had served its purpose as the final sanctuary of an age that was ending. But its true legacy lay not in the buildings that had been destroyed or the groves that had been burned, but in the seeds of wisdom that had been scattered on winds that would carry them to times and places where they could take root in new soil and grow into forms that even the Druids themselves could not have foreseen. In the grey years that followed the burning of Anglesey, as Roman order settled over the Celtic lands like a shroud woven from administrative efficiency and military discipline, the last Druids wandered paths that grew increasingly solitary and strange. These were not the confident masters of ancient wisdom who had once commanded the respect of kings and the devotion of entire peoples, but survivors carrying fragments of a shattered tradition, keepers of knowledge that the world no longer seemed to want or understand. Picture them as they moved through landscapes transformed beyond recognition. Forests cleared for Roman villas, sacred springs diverted to feed Roman baths, stone circles abandoned to weeds and weather, while new temples rose to honor foreign gods. The very geography of the sacred had been rewritten, with Roman roads cut in straight lines across territories that had once been organized around the subtle curves of energy that flowed through earth and stone. Where pilgrims had once traveled to groves that pulsed with otherworldly power, merchants now hurried along highways designed for efficiency rather than reverence. Some of these last Druids found refuge in the wild places that Roman civilization had not yet reached or had deemed too poor or dangerous to merit conquest. In the mist-shrouded highlands of Scotland, where ancient lochs reflected skies that seemed to hold memories of older worlds, small communities of the faithful gathered around hidden springs and forgotten stone circles. Here, in caves that echoed with whispered prayers and groves that grew in secret valleys, the old rituals continued with a poignancy that came from knowing they might be performed for the last time. These refugee Druids faced challenges that their predecessors could never have imagined. The great oral tradition that had been their pride required communities of learned practitioners to maintain its integrity. But such communities could no longer gather openly without risking Roman attention. Knowledge that had once been shared freely among hundreds of initiates now rested in the minds of scattered individuals who might go months without encountering another keeper of the ancient wisdom. Many adapted by encoding their deepest teachings in forms that could survive even if their original contexts were lost. The great mythological cycles were compressed into folk tales that traveling storytellers could carry from village to village without attracting suspicion. Astronomical calculations were disguised as agricultural lore, while healing formulas became traditional remedies passed down through families of herb wives and village wise women. The gods themselves were gradually transformed into local saints and legendary heroes whose stories preserved essential truths about the relationship between human and divine. Yet something irreplaceable was being lost in this process of adaptation and concealment. The Druidic tradition had always been more than the sum of its individual elements. It had been a living system where every part reinforced and illuminated every other part, where the healer's knowledge of plants connected seamlessly to the astronomer's understanding of celestial cycles, where the judge's grasp of law flowed naturally from the prophet's communion with divine will. As this integrated wisdom was broken into fragments and scattered across different communities and traditions, the connections that had given it its power began to weaken and fade. Some Druids chose a different path, one that led not to preservation, but to transformation. These visionaries understood that the old world was truly ending, that the wheel of ages was turning toward a phase where different forms of wisdom would be needed to guide humanity through challenges that lay ahead. Instead of trying to maintain their traditions unchanged, they began to plant seeds of Druidic insight within the new religious and philosophical movements that were emerging throughout the Roman world. In the mystery schools that flourished in cities like Alexandria and Athens, former Druids found ways to teach the essential principles of their tradition using Greek philosophical language and Roman organizational methods. The Celtic understanding of the interconnectedness of all life became the foundation for new schools of natural philosophy, while Druidic insights into the relationship between consciousness and cosmic order influenced emerging forms of mystical practice that would eventually shape the development of Christian monasticism. Others found in the growing Christian movement a vehicle that could carry forward aspects of Celtic spirituality in new forms. The early Celtic church that emerged in Ireland and Scotland preserved many Druidic practices under Christian symbolism, with monasteries built on sites that had been sacred groves, with festivals that honored Christ while maintaining the seasonal rhythms that the Druids had celebrated for millennia. The illuminated manuscripts produced in these monasteries wove Celtic spiral designs together with Christian imagery, creating art that spoke simultaneously to old gods and new. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation came through the deliberate creation of legend. Some of the last Druids, understanding that their historical tradition was ending, chose to invest their deepest wisdom in mythical figures who could carry that wisdom forward through whatever changes lay ahead. The figure of Merlin, the wizard who served as counselor to King Arthur, became a repository for Druidic knowledge about prophecy and magic, while the stories of the Grail quest preserved Celtic teachings about the spiritual journey in forms that could inspire seekers for generations to come. These legendary transformations were not betrayals of the Druidic tradition, but its ultimate fulfillment, for the Druids had always understood that truth was more important than the particular forms through which it was expressed. By allowing their wisdom to be reborn in new mythologies and religious movements, they ensured that essential insights about the nature of existence would survive even when the groves had crumbled and the stone circles stood empty. The process was not without its costs. Many Druids lived to see their sacred sites converted to other purposes, their holy wells blessed by Christian priests, their seasonal festivals transformed into celebrations of the church calendar. The pain of such transformations was real and deep, for these changes represented not just the end of a tradition, but the passing of the entire way of understanding human relationship to the natural world. Some could not bear to witness such changes, and chose to follow what the legends call the straight road, a mystical departure from the ordinary world that was neither death nor exile, but a translation to realms beyond the reach of historical change. These Druids were said to have walked into the mist of otherworld, joining the immortal company of those who had passed beyond the need for physical incarnation, while remaining available to help and guide those who called upon their wisdom with pure hearts. Others found solace in prophecies that spoke of return, visions that showed the wheel of ages turning full circle to bring back times when the earth would once again be honored as sacred, when the old wisdom would emerge from its hiding places to guide humanity through crises that lay far in the future. These prophetic Druids understood that endings were also beginnings, that the apparent defeat of their tradition was actually its metamorphosis into forms that could survive challenges that the original Celtic world could never have faced. The last historical records of practicing Druids come from remote corners of Ireland and Scotland, where isolated communities maintained fragments of the ancient ways well into the early medieval period. But even these final practitioners were different from their predecessors, for they carried within themselves the knowledge that they were the end of something rather than its continuation. Their rituals had the quality of memorial services, their teachings the poignancy of final testaments. Yet, in another sense, the Druids never truly disappeared, but underwent a transformation that allowed their essential insights to permeate Western culture in ways both obvious and subtle. The Romantic movement that swept through European literature and art carried within it distinctly Druidic sensibilities about the relationship between human consciousness and natural beauty. The scientific revolution that began in the Renaissance was shaped by Celtic mathematical insights that had been preserved in monastic libraries. Even the modern environmental movement draws upon intuitions about the sacred nature of the earth that can be traced back to groves where white-robed figures once offered prayers to gods whose names have been forgotten, but whose presence still moves through forest and stream. The twilight of the Druids was not simply an ending, but a sunset that painted the sky with colours that would be remembered long after darkness fell. Their wisdom became woven into the very fabric of Western consciousness, influencing philosophy and science, art and literature, religion and politics in ways that continue to shape our world today. The groves may have been burned and the stone circles abandoned, but the vision they represented of a world where human and divine, natural and supernatural, individual and cosmic are recognized as aspects of a single, sacred whole, continues to call to hearts that hunger for connection to something greater than the purely material concerns that dominate modern life. As night settled over the last sacred grove, where a lone druid offered the final prayers to gods who were departing into legend, the very air seemed to shimmer with promise. The ancient ways were ending, but the eternal truths they had carried were being planted like seeds in the fertile darkness of a new age, waiting for the proper season to sprout into forms that the world would one day desperately need. In the deep quiet of a 21st century forest, where ancient oaks still cast shadows older than written memory, and streams still sing with voices that know no human language, something lingers that those with sensitive ears can almost hear. Whispers of a wisdom that refused to die with the burning of sacred groves. Echoes of an understanding that survived the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of medieval Christianity, the Industrial Revolution and the digital age, waiting patiently for hearts humble enough to listen and minds open enough to receive what the Druids always knew would eventually be needed again. The legacy they left behind was not carved in stone or written on parchment, but woven into the very fabric of consciousness itself, seeded into the collective imagination of humanity, where it could grow and flower in whatever forms each generation would require. Walk through any modern city, and you will find traces of their influence in the parks that preserve islands of green within concrete and steel, in the environmental movements that recognize the earth as sacred, in the healing arts that treat body and spirit as inseparable aspects of a single whole. The romantic poets who walked the mountains of Wales and Scotland in the 18th and 19th centuries carried within their verses distinctly Druidic insights about the relationship between human consciousness and natural beauty. When Wordsworth wrote of intimations of immortality gleaned from communion with landscape, when Coleridge described the sacred river that ran through caverns measureless to man, when Blake envisioned England's green and pleasant land, they channeled understandings that had first been articulated in groves where mistletoe grew on ancient oaks and springs bubbled with waters that reflected more than sky. The scientific revolution that reshaped Western understanding of the natural world drew upon mathematical insights that had been preserved in the monasteries where former Druids had found refuge. The The geometric principles encoded in stone circles found new expression in the calculations that tracked planetary motion and decoded the architecture of atoms. The Druidic understanding of pattern and connection, of the unity that underlies apparent diversity, became the foundation for ecological thinking that recognizes the interdependence of all living systems. Modern psychology rediscovered what the Druids had always known about the relationship between individual consciousness and the collective unconscious, about the power of symbol and story to transform human understanding at levels deeper than rational thought. Jung's archetypes echo the Celtic understanding of gods and goddesses as universal patterns that shape human experience across cultures and centuries. The therapeutic use of myth and ritual draws upon techniques that Druidic healers had developed for addressing spiritual as well as physical ailments. Even the technologies that define contemporary life carry within them principles that the ancient Druids would recognize. The internet that connects minds across vast distances mirrors their understanding of consciousness as a web that links all beings in networks of communication and influence. The quantum physics that reveals the fundamental interconnectedness of matter and energy at the smallest scales confirms insights that Druidic sages had reached through contemplation of the patterns that connect oak tree to standing stone, human heart to wheeling star. The environmental crises that threaten the stability of modern civilization have awakened a hunger for the kind of wisdom that the Druids embodied. Understanding that recognizes the earth not as resource to be exploited, but as sacred presence to be honored, that sees human beings not as masters of nature, but as conscious participants in the ongoing work of creation. The ancient groves may have been burned, but the vision they represented of humanity living in harmony with the natural world rather than in opposition to it has become more relevant than ever as we face the consequences of forgetting such fundamental truths. The sacred sites themselves continue to whisper their secrets to those who approach them with proper reverence. Stonehenge still captures the light of the solstice sun, still marks the complex cycles that connect earthly time to cosmic rhythm. Newgrange still channels the returning light into its heart of darkness, still serves as a monument to humanity's eternal quest to understand our place in the vast machinery of existence. The stone circles scattered across the Celtic lands still hum with energies that sensitive instruments can detect but cannot fully explain, still serve as focal points for the invisible forces that flow through landscape and consciousness alike. Modern practitioners of earth-based spirituality have rediscovered many of the techniques that the Druids used to commune with the natural world, to read the signs written in cloud and flame, wind and water. Neo-pagan movements that honor the old gods under new names carry forward aspects of Celtic wisdom adapted to contemporary needs and understandings. Herbal healers who learn the properties of plants through direct communion rather than merely chemical analysis practice arts that would be familiar to any Druidic sage who ever gathered mistletoe from sacred oaks. The stories themselves have proven to be the most durable vessels for preserving Druidic wisdom, for myths and legends carry within them truths that transcend the particular circumstances of their creation. The tales of Arthur and his knights continue to inspire seekers of the Grail that represents not just mystical attainment, but the healing of the wasteland that results when human beings forget their proper relationship to the sacred. The legends of Celtic gods and goddesses speak to contemporary audiences hungry for meaning that goes deeper than material success or technological achievement. Children's stories still echo with themes that the Druids wove into their greatest teachings, tales of talking animals that carry messages from the other world, of magical forests where ordinary rules do not apply, of quests that transform the seeker as much as they achieve their apparent objectives. These stories plant seeds in young imaginations that may not sprout until adulthood brings challenges that require more than rational solutions, crises that can only be navigated with the help of wisdom that speaks to the whole human being rather than merely the thinking mind. The festivals that mark the turning points of the year, celebrations of solstice and equinox, of the first stirring of spring and the final harvest of autumn, continue to draw people who hunger for connection to rhythms deeper than the artificial cycles of modern life. Whether celebrated as Druidic holidays or adapted into other traditions, these festivals preserve the understanding that human beings are not separate from the natural world, but a part of its endless dance of death and renewal, darkness and light. In the universities where scholars study the fragments of Celtic literature that survived the destruction of the groves, in the laboratories where scientists explore the quantum connections that link consciousness to physical reality, in the therapy rooms where healers work to restore wholeness to lives fragmented by modern pressures, the essential insights of the Druidic tradition continue to find new expression. The forms change, but the core understanding remains, that existence is fundamentally sacred, that consciousness and cosmos are intimately connected, that wisdom lies not in domination, but in harmony with forces greater than individual will. The prophecies that the last Druids whispered as they walked into legend spoke of a time when the ancient wisdom would return in new forms, when the children of the modern world would rediscover the truths that their ancestors had forgotten in the rush toward technological power and material abundance. They foresaw a generation that would face crises so profound that only wisdom could navigate them, challenges that would require not just clever solutions, but transformation of consciousness itself. Perhaps that time has already begun, in the growing recognition that environmental destruction threatens not just human civilization, but the web of life that sustains all beings, in the search for meaning that goes beyond consumption and competition, in the hunger for connection to sources of guidance that transcend purely human understanding. We can glimpse the return of needs that only Druidic forms of wisdom can truly address. The groves may have been burned and the stone circles abandoned, but the understanding they represented lives on in every moment when human consciousness opens to the mystery that surrounds and sustains us. It echoes in every act of reverence for the natural world, every recognition that the earth is sacred, every choice that honors the interconnectedness of all life. The Druids understood that their deepest teaching was not any particular technique or belief, but the cultivation of awareness that could perceive the sacred dimension of existence that is always present, always available to those humble enough to listen for the whispers that remain. In the end, the greatest monument to the Druidic tradition is not any physical structure, but the possibility that still exists in every human heart. the possibility of awakening to the wonder and wisdom that surrounds us always, waiting only for the quiet mind and open spirit that can receive what the ancient oaks still offer to those who remember how to sit in silence beneath their branches and hear the voices that speak in languages older than words, carrying truths that are newer than tomorrow's dawn. As twilight settles over the modern world and stars appear in skies that still remember the prayers of white-robed figures who walked between the worlds, the whispers of the Druids continue to call to all who have ears to hear, promising that the wisdom of the groves is not lost but transformed, not ended but eternally beginning again in every moment when human consciousness touches the sacred mystery that is our deepest inheritance and our brightest hope.